Alright, everything is perfect. You guys are looking great. And Mrs. Andrews, what a dulcet face. You look sweeter than a bottle of honey. Let me take a final look at the instructions. I'm sorry, do you want me to include the estate as well? Isn't it supposed to be a double portrait? Yeah, but we want the farm and the animals in the painting too. But isn't this supposed to be a celebration of you two marrying each other? Yeah, but we'd like to have everything included in the painting. Do one thing, paint everything. As far as you can see, that would be great. Oh, alright, what a coxcomb. This conversation is not historically accurate, but it captures the essence of what might have happened when Thomas Gainsborough, the painter, was preparing to paint perhaps the most British painting ever, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. This painting is one of those paintings where the more you look, the weirder things get. For starters, the first thing that might have caught your attention is the languid, thin, and unnatural bodies of the couple, especially Mrs. Andrews. Then there's the face and the head. What's wrong with her eyes? Why does it look so uncanny? And what's up with the dress? Why is it spread like that? Why is there a blank, unpainted space on Mrs. Andrews' lap? What is she holding? There are a lot of questions here, but when you zoom out and look at the entire painting, there's something that you might not notice but definitely feel. What is this painting supposed to be? It's not a landscape painting, it's definitely not a portrait painting either, and it certainly is not a conversational painting. A simple painting at first glance hides so many secrets and stories that can only be seen with a closer inspection. So in this episode of Artsight, we are going to Georgian England to know the interesting story behind this painting. And trust me, the amount of snobbery, show-off and stupidity in this painting will surprise you. So get the cups ready because I'm about to spill the tea. Let's start with an introduction. Meet Robert Andrews, a landlord who inherited most of his fortune from his father, who was also a very rich man, and he was very powerful. While everything was handed down to Robert on a silver platter, he did use the fortune wisely after the death of his father. When this painting was painted, Robert owned almost 3,000 acres or almost 7.5 square miles of land. For comparison, here's how much Mr. Andrews would have owned if he lived in Manhattan. That's a lot. So the snobbery you see in his body language and face can be understood. But what about the woman? That's Frances Andrews. While not as rich as Robert, was still in the circle of the wealthy folks. Her family had made a big name in the drapery business and were quite wealthy. The perfect woman for Robert. Now, speaking of the happiness that this marriage brought, you can see the love and happiness in the eyes of Frances, the genuine smile on her face, that shine in her eyes. Alright, enough with the sarcasm. She clearly does not look happy, and she can't even hide that in this painting. And if you think about it, why would she be happy? This union was less of a marriage and more of a business transaction. Let me tell you exactly what's going on in this painting and the story behind Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. Let's start with the painting. This painting is not a portrait. This would have been a portrait, or perhaps this. This is also not a landscape painting. This would have been a landscape painting. In fact, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews should be called Mr. and Mrs. Andrews and the land these rich people own. Portrait paintings usually put the subject in a beautiful landscape, but the subjects take the center stage. This was the first time ever in the history of paintings that a portrait painting put the subjects aside and gave the landscape more space. But how is that supposed to be a negative thing? Gainsborough loved painting the landscape and despised painting portraits. More on that later. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem here is that the attention to the landscape is not given due to its beauty, but due to the utter snobbery of these people and the tasteless display of wealth. The couple, or just Mr. Andrews, wanted to show off the land that he was getting as dowry from Mrs. Andrews' family. Also, it's worth noting that these lands were the lands of common people until the Parliament put the Enclosure Act, which gave wealthy landowners the right to enclose the common land and make it their own. One part of the land you see in the background was already bought by Robert Andrews Sr., the father of the male subject here, while the other part was given to them as dowry. So they wanted to show off their combined wealth and land, even if it meant that they would be pushed aside in their own portrait. But the snobbery does not end there. Something you might have noticed is the way Mrs. Andrews' dress is set on the bench. Why is it spread like that? Well, they have to show off this beautiful satin dress of blue color, a color that was extremely rare and expensive at that time. After all, she comes from a family of draper business owners. And if you think this was just an oversight, then take a look at this painting of Mrs. Andrews' parents. Here, the dress is spread wider and in a more flamboyant way. Now, let's come to Mr. Andrews. He's standing with his gun after coming from a hunt. That is also a show of wealth, as only landowners with large enough property were allowed to hunt game. The parallel rows of corn you can see here shows that they preferred using expensive modern agricultural machines compared to manual labor. So basically it's them saying we take their lands and then we take their jobs. And who can forget the sheep and horses in the background? After all, it's a portrait of a newlywed couple in love. Of course they should be included in the portrait. It is almost as if they prepared a list of all the things they can do to show off their wealth in this painting. And nothing matters when it comes to showing off your wealth, right? This is what makes this painting such a snobbish mess, and Gainsborough did not like it. In a witty way, he kind of took revenge on them as well. And that revenge can be seen in the empty space on Mrs. Andrews' lap. Let's talk about the blank spot in the canvas. One of the biggest mysteries about this painting is the blank space here, near the hands of Mrs. Andrews. But it is not just a blank space. She is supposed to be holding something that was either removed from the canvas or left unfinished. Some people claim that it was left there for a baby, but if that's the case, then why wasn't it added later? The couple had 9 children. Yeah, 9. Poor Mrs. Andrews. Most people agree that the blank space was supposed to have a dead pheasant cock. You can see the partially painted feathers in her hands. It fits the scene as well. Mr. Andrews with his gun came after a mighty hunt of a pheasant, giving the trophy to his wife. Oh, by the way, their house is just opposite to the oak tree. You can see the present day estate and the house, and surprisingly, the oak tree is still there. So if this was supposed to be a dead pheasant, why was it removed? Well, apparently, Gainsborough had played a little prank on them. In Dutch paintings, which were a big source of inspiration for Gainsborough, women holding pheasant cocks was a metaphor for women holding the genitals of men in a controlling way. It's quite literally, pardon my French, grabbing the man by the balls. So perhaps the artist was trying to show how Mrs. Andrews is controlling her husband, and perhaps when the couple got to know about it, either they asked him to stop painting the pheasant or they removed it by themselves. And that's the story about the couple and their flamboyant yet embarrassing show of the wealth that they did not even earn themselves. Now let's get to know a little bit more about Thomas Gainsborough. Gainsborough was an interesting person. He was inspired by the paintings of Anthony van Dyck, and you can see the inspiration seeping from his paintings when you put Dyck's works next to his works. Gainsborough was also from a rich family, although not as rich as Mr. Roberts' family. Gainsborough's father was a weaver, so the artist pretty much grew up with fabric. That's another reason why you see the magnificent attention to the fabric in almost all the portrait paintings he has ever made. Another thing worth noting was his love for landscape paintings. He loved painting the scenes that he saw, of rural England, of the trees, the clouds, and yet, out of the 179 publicly available paintings he did, only 30 are landscape paintings. The rest are all portraits. Why? Because portraits paid. Gainsborough was a very popular painter. It is said that he could paint a head and shoulder portrait in just 1 hour and 40 minutes, a speed unheard of. Plus, he had strategically moved to Bath, where all the elites lived, and enjoyed a circle of popular people with a lot of money and self-love to get their portraits done, without caring about the price. But not only did he despise the people, but also the portraits, while making the portrait of Sarah Siddons, a very popular actress of that time. He exclaimed, "Damn your nose, there's no end to it." Poor Mrs. Sarah. It looks fine to me, right? And yet, despite his rude behavior, Thomas Gainsborough became one of the most popular painters from England, far surpassing the fame of these two people sitting here. And that was all about the painting and the people in it. Consider subscribing if you liked the video. We're trying to show the interesting stories and meanings behind these paintings that are often ignored. After all, you need a little art in your heart. Till we meet next time, have a wonderful day.